In Module 5, we focused on the demand curve. Module 6 will be all about the supply curve. In 7, we'll start putting it together. So let's go ahead and set up your drawing for supply. Just like demand, price goes on the y-axis and quantity goes on the x-axis. Those things don't move because they're there whether we're focusing on demand or supply. And you always have to have a title for a simple supply and demand model showing the name of the good. So I just wrote general name of good here, just so you remember that you always need to have a title dependent on what good you're focusing on. Now, supply goes in a different direction than demand. Remember, we call it a demand curve and a supply curve because it might curve a little bit, usually when you're plotting numbers, but it's fine to simplify it and just to draw a straight line as well if you would like. But supply is upward sloping. As price increases, the quantity supplied will increase as well. We'll focus on Y in this module and also learn about the shifters of supply. When we learned about demand, that tends to be simpler because you're used to thinking like a consumer. You've bought products in the past. And whenever you're buying something from the demand perspective as a consumer, you want the price to be low. Now, supply is the opposite. These are the people that are producing, they are making the individual goods, or maybe they're selling them at their store. So suppliers care about a higher price. So they have the opposite incentive. And that's why supply can be a little bit trickier because you have to think from the opposite point of view. So as prices rise, the quantity the producers want to supply rises too. So you can see on the model with the price of coffee beans and the quantity of coffee beans, as the price that coffee beans are being sold for goes up, the amount that producers are willing to supply goes up as well. At the equilibrium price and quantity, producers are willing to produce 10 billion pounds of coffee. But if the price went up to maybe $2 per pound of coffee, the quantity that they are willing to supply is closer to 12. So it went from 10 to 12, it increased. They're willing to supply more at a higher price. So the major concept to think about with supply is that producers care very much about making a profit. That's the incentive that motivates them the most. So there's various things that goes into cost of production. One of the things that affects cost of production is labor costs. How many workers do you need to produce the product? And what if you have to pay those workers more? If it costs you more to make the product, that's going to cut into your profit. And if your profit goes down, supply decreases. On the other side, if there's something else that goes into cost of production, like the cost of the materials that you make to produce your good, if all of a sudden those goods are cheaper, now your profit went up, so your desire to supply goods went up. So anytime costs to the company, to the producer rise, they're going to supply less of that product. Anytime costs to producers falls, they will supply more. It's whatever makes them the biggest profit. We saw demand schedules in Module 5. Supply schedules are very similar. They're both going to be a table that shows us prices, but because it's a supply schedule, the other column will show us the quantity supplied. Now, since we learned that producers respond to profits, as the price of a good falls, producers will want to supply less, which we can see in this supply schedule. So at $5 per soda, that's the highest price offered here, and producers are going to love the high price, and they're going to supply as much as they can. So in this case, if they're able to sell soda for $5 a piece, they're going to supply 250. And you can see that plotted in this supply drawing as well. So when the price is $5, if you follow that across, Trying to make a visual dotted line. Okay, so we have the point here where the price is $5 and the quantity is 250, the quantity supplied. So that fits what we would think. As the price goes down to $3, they'll supply fewer. They'll supply 150. So we have $3 and 150 right there. And then at $1, that's much cheaper. They will supply some sodas, but far fewer than they would before. So 50 sodas are produced at this point. And then you just connect all the lines, label it, or connect all the dots, label it with an S, and you have the supply curve plotted. Now in this slide, we're seeing that both demand schedules and supply schedules can have multiple columns. So the original supply schedule is here. We have the price and we have the original quantity. So looking at it like that, it's very simple. At $2, 11.6 billion pounds of coffee will be produced. So at $2, we have 11.6 right here. And then you can follow the points all the way down, that if only 50 cents is the price of coffee, then 8 billion pounds will be produced. And of course, there's all the points in between. But this entire column here is our S1. That's our first supply curve. So that entire column matches up. Now, in this situation, we have had additional coffee producers enter the market. So you learned before demand that something like taste can shift demand. So maybe all of a sudden coffee is really popular. It's very trendy. And so more people decide that they want to start growing coffee beans. That's going to have more producers than before. So our next column shows after entry. Now we have more coffee producers than before. So instead of 11.6 billion pounds of coffee, we have 13.9 billion pounds of coffee being produced. So at every single point along this table, there's a higher number being supplied. That shows you that supply overall increased. It shifted to the right, which is what we can see in this drawing. The law of supply is stating that other things being equal, all other things equal, ceteris paribus, the price and quantity supplied of a good are directly related. Just to review what that means. So if price and quantity are directly related, that means that if one is going up, so in this case, if price is going up, what should happen to the quantity? If it's directly related, the quantity is also going up. So according to our supply schedule, as the price for coffee beans is rising, the amount supplied is also rising. Direct relationship between the two. This is in contrast to the law of demand, where price and quantity were inversely related. When the price went up, the quantity that you demanded would go down. So now we have all the pieces put together for supply and demand, just to see how price relates to both of them. So in general, all other things equal, producers will produce more if the good is being sold at a higher price. They would love to sell you the product at the highest price possible, but consumers will buy less if there's a higher price, and that affects the demand curve. So supply will always be upward sloping and demand will always be downward sloping. You can see in this model that the equilibrium price is $1, but let's look above equilibrium. So anything in this area above the line I just drew is showing a price that's higher than equilibrium. And you can see that supply, the red line for supply, is bigger. The quantity supplied is bigger than the blue line showing demand. And as the price gets higher, 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 the gap between them is also growing. The higher the price, the more suppliers would like to supply, but the less consumers will demand. You can also see that relationship below equilibrium price when the prices are really, really low in this section. The lower the prices, the more the demand there is. People would love to buy a product at a low price, but suppliers do not want to supply very much, especially if it's cutting into their profit. So as the price falls and gets lower and lower, the gap gets larger. Demand will be higher than supply when the price is really, really low. Just like demand, supply has two possible options. Supply can have a move along the curve, or supply can shift. Now, what's nice is that there's consistency between these two things. With demand, the thing that caused the move along the curve was a change in price of that good. And that's also true for supply. It works for both. So if the price of the individual good is the thing that changes, that will be a move along the curve, not a shift. And one more thing, we learned in demand that there's a difference between a change. We talked about how demand could increase, demand could decrease, or the quantity demanded increased, the quantity demanded decreased. That word quantity only applies to a move along the curve. So in this picture here, from A to B, you can see that we had a move along the curve that is on the exact same supply curve. Now, what do you think is happening to price from A to B? Is price of that good increasing or decreasing? It's increasing because the arrow itself is showing that prices have gone up. By the way, this good still is coffee beans that we're talking about. So if the price of coffee beans rises, you're going to have a move along the curve. So you would say that the quantity supplied increased from A to B. Because see how the quantity supplied was 10 billion pounds? Now it's 11.2 billion pounds. Quantity supplied increased, which is different from A to C. That's a shift. If the entire line moves, you would say that supply increased. A to B is the quantity supplied increased. I know that's really confusing the first time you're learning it. I'm going to keep hitting it over and over again. As long as you're getting the idea that quantity, a change in quantity of something, shows the move along the curve, and moves along the curve are only changed by prices of that good. Also, just like demand, if supply shifts, it will shift to the right or shift to the left, and we call that a change in supply. Anytime you have a right shift, it's an increase. Doesn't matter if it's demand or supply. And the reason why is that 0 is still here. So our original line is S1. If S1 moves to S2, you can see that we had a right shift, and you can see that that's getting further away from 0. So right shift is still an increase. And S1 to S3, we have a left shift. It's getting closer to 0, therefore it's a decrease in supply. Now, I want to explain, I'll try to draw it here for you. Sometimes people draw supply more like that. So this is our original supply line, and I'll do P and Q just to show you. Okay, so which direction is a decrease? A decrease is a left shift, right? Left shift. Now this is where people get thrown off, because I just drew a decrease, but it looks like the line is up, doesn't it? That's why I keep talking about left and right. That in this case, I'll draw one more. We're going to show a right shift. All right. So a right shift means supply increased. You might say, but that one's below and the other one is above. No such thing. As long as you start thinking about it with left shifts and right shifts, it'll be much simpler to keep it straight. So our drawing here, supply decreased, left shift. Our drawing here, supply increased, right shift. So keep those words straight. Now that you've learned that a change in the price of the individual good is the non-shifter, it's the move along the curve for supply, we're going to get into what shifts supply. in demand, I gave you an acronym, MERIT, to remember all the different shifters of the demand curve. The funny one that I came up with, that's a little memorable for supply, is racist. Okay, so the R in merit and racist is actually the same. Same with the E. So the R and the E in both categories actually stand for the same words. We're going to see how they function differently, but related goods or related prices, we're going to yet again have complements and substitutes. Now, these are going to be different examples. So you're going to have to learn how to differentiate, is that a complement in demand or is it a complement in supply? And we'll practice that. But complements are still and, they're goods that go together. And substitutes are still or, one or the other. The next shifter of supply is I for input prices. Inputs are goods that go into producing other goods. They're ingredients and raw materials. C stands for competition. This is the number of producers producing the good. When we had that example where more coffee growers decided to produce coffee, that was a change in competition, the number of producers, and that did shift the supply line. E stands for expectations in both supply and demand. In demand, we talked about how consumers expect prices to change. Well, producers and stores expect prices to change too. And they're going to respond to that differently, but they are also aware of these same expectations. S stands for subsidies and taxes. These are going to affect the overall prices and therefore affect profit, which shifts supply. And then finally, technology. Basically, can the producer produce more or less with technology? That will also shift supply. We're going to do a slide on each of these and practice each of these supply shifters. R in racist is for related prices of goods and services for supply. For supply, we're always thinking about it from the perspective of the producer. They're the ones that are doing the supplying. They are a company. And remember, what is the thing that motivates producers? Profit. So that's going to be the motive that will determine which substitute they produce. Now, at that manufacturing plant, they can often produce more than one product. So an oil refinery could produce gasoline or heating oil or natural gas. You might know that petroleum that comes from those products could also produce petroleum jelly for chapstick and all kinds of things. So there's lots of different products that they could choose to produce. Do I want to focus my company on this good or on that good? That makes them substitute goods because they are or. Down at the bottom in green, I have some other examples. A baker could supply cakes or cookies. And you might say, well, why can't they produce both? Well, they probably will produce a little bit of both. But if all of a sudden one of these things is in high demand and they're going to make more money from producing it, wouldn't they spend more hours in the day producing one? Wouldn't the supply of one of those goods go up? Same thing with clothing manufacturers. They could choose to supply women's clothing or men's clothing. How are they going to allocate their resources? Women's clothing tends to be sold at higher prices. Therefore, clothing manufacturers choose to supply more women's clothing than men's clothing. So here we're looking at red now. The quantity of any good a producer will supply is dependent on the price of the other goods it can produce. If you have options, you're going to choose to supply the good that you will make the most money from producing. Now let's go ahead and do the example questions from your notes. A producer can produce good A or good B, and we know that they're substitute goods because it tells you or. They can make one or the other. What will happen to the supply of good B if the price of good A falls? Now, price, from the perspective of the producer controlling supply, price is how much they're going to be able to sell it for. So if the price they can sell good A for decreases, Which good do they want to make? Do they want to make good A or do they want to make good B? They're going to want to make good B. If good A now has a lower price for them to sell it for, they're going to choose to supply more of good B. So the supply of good B will increase, and an increase is always a right shift. Next example. So the first one, we had some kind of generic good A and good B. Sometimes questions are worded that way. Other times they are specific products. So soybeans and corn are substitutes because they could be grown on the same field by the same farmer. So the farmer has to decide, on this field, will I grow soybeans or corn? I can't grow both at the exact same time. I only have this one field. So the price of soybeans is going to increase. So the price that they can sell soybeans for is now higher than it used to be. Price of corn hasn't changed. So which one do you think they're going to want to grow? Are they going to want to grow soybeans or corn if the price of soybeans went up? They're going to decide to supply soybeans. Therefore, the supply of corn will decrease. If you shift all of your resources to supplying soybeans, that means they're going to be making less corn than they were before. So if the supply of corn decreases, it shifts to the left. The other subcategory of related goods or services within supply is complementary goods. So sometimes producers are actually producing two goods at the same time. One good is a byproduct for the other good, which makes them complementary. They're making both of them, so these products go together as an and, not an or. So when a company is producing peanut butter, the act of squeezing and compressing to produce the peanut butter also results in the production of peanut oil that they can sell as a separate product. When manufacturers are processing crude oil, they also, by drilling for crude oil, are gaining access to natural gas, a whole separate product that they can also sell. When producers are cutting down 2x4s, they're getting leftover wood pulp that they can sell to someone else to make into plywood. So all of these things are and. They are complements, they go together. One of my personal favorite examples of complements in supply is donuts and donut holes. If you're familiar with how donuts are made, they roll out the dough, and when they're stamping the O shape to get the donut, they end up with a donut hole. So no one has to go out of their way to make a separate donut hole. They're made simultaneously. They're complements in supply. So if the price of donuts rose, are they going to want to make more or less in general? Remember, producers like high prices. So if the price goes up, they're going to want to supply more. Honestly, they're going to want to supply more of each. The quantity supplied of donuts goes up, but the overall supply of donut holes goes up because by making more donuts for that high price, they're going to end up with more donut holes too. And if the supply increases, it will shift to the right. The I in racist is input prices. An input is anything that is used that goes into producing a good or service. It's very important to see that an input is not the same thing as the change in price of the actual final product. So, if the actual price of the good changed, what does that look like on a supply and demand model? A price change by itself of the product that you're drawing is a move along the curve. So let's get into some examples of what are inputs then. So think of a regular pencil that you use, the number 2 pencil. What are some inputs that you would need to produce it? You might need wood, graphite or lead. You might need some metal to go around the eraser, maybe some rubber for the eraser. All of those things are inputs. And if the price of any of those individual things, the price of graphite decided to fall, that would affect the overall price, the profit of the good, and that's why it's going to shift the good. Let's do some examples on the next slide. Okay, so if the input prices go up, so one of the inputs or a lot of the inputs, but if the inputs go up in price, what's going to happen to the overall cost of production for that good? It's going to go up. It's going to increase. And if costs of production are high, that's cutting into profit. So our first example here. Describe the shift to the supply curve if the cost of an input for the good fell. So if input prices are falling, it's going to shift which direction? It will shift to the right, because if the input prices are down, that means your profit is up, so you can supply more of that good. Next example, we have a specific one here. If the price of fertilizer rose, what is the effect on the supply of corn? You need fertilizer in order to grow corn, so it's an input for corn. Price of fertilizer rose. How does that affect profit? It hurts the profit. The cost of production went up, so they will supply less corn. The supply of corn would decrease. It will shift to the left. The C for racist stands for competition, which is the number of producers. If you are producing a good and no one else makes it, then the competition is low. If you are producing a good and a lot of other people start producing it too, then you have competition. That's why competition can stand for the number of producers. So size is important to determine if a market is competitive. We learned that before. In terms of supply and demand, the market needs to be competitive if it has a large number of suppliers and a large number of consumers. So, thankfully, in terms of the shift, this one is very straightforward. If the number of producers increased, there are more people making the product, what's going to happen to the supply of that product? It's going to increase. It'll shift right. If all of a sudden there are far fewer people making the product, maybe a lot of companies bought out other companies, which can decrease the overall supply. So competition, all other things equal, is just how many people are making it. If more people make it, supply goes up. If fewer people make it, supply goes down. Expectations of supply are a little bit harder to understand than expectations in demand. In general, expectations is this concept that the price of the good is expected to change in the future. We might think it's going to go down in price or it might go up in price, but in general, consumers and producers both play the same games. They both know what's going to happen with prices. And producers, because they care about a profit, their job is to sell as much as possible when the price is high, and as little as possible when the price is low. So they can adjust supply. Now, in this case, expectations, don't think of supply in terms of how much they're going to make. Think about it in terms of stocking the shelves. What is actually available to be purchased at each price? So they can take things off the shelf and store them if they think the price is going to be low at this or coming up. So if they expect the price to be lower in the future, how would smart producers shift supply today? Do they want you to buy the product now at the high price, or do they want you to buy the product in the future at the low price? They want you to buy it now. So they're going to put as much as possible on the shelves today to encourage you to buy it at a high price and hopefully reduce the inventory by the time the sale rolls around. Some of you might have worked at a store that has a sale coming up, and your bosses will tell you to take certain products off the shelves, and you're reducing the supply available to be bought at that low price. Same thing with Black Friday sales. A store might advertise that laptops are going to be sold for a low price, but they'll actually take most of the supply of the laptops away, maybe only sell 2 or 3 at that low price. because they don't want to supply a lot when the price is low. So if a company is producing Christmas trees, we're talking artificial, maybe pre-lit Christmas trees that can be stored. So should this company supply the same amount to stores year-round, one of those Christmas stores that's always open, or should they store the trees and increase the supply when the value and price of the trees will be the highest? The answer is they should reduce the supply. When they expect the prices to be lower, people aren't going to spend a huge amount of money on a Christmas tree in May. And they're going to increase the supply when they expect the price to be going up. So right around Thanksgiving time, they're going to probably increase the supply in the stores, expecting the price to increase. Subsidies and taxes are two things that actually work in opposite ways to address the overall cost to producers of producing a good. So a subsidy is money given by the government. Governments decide to subsidize businesses that they're trying to help out. So sometimes we subsidize businesses in America because they otherwise would go out of business. So there's lots of different farmers that cannot sell their products at the prices low enough to feed American families and still stay in business. So if we want milk costs to be low, bread costs to be low, a lot of these things that we consider basic foods in America, the government subsidizes them. It keeps the costs down to consumers, but it also makes it profitable for those farmers to produce those goods. If they could only sell low prices, nobody would want to produce that good, and that would be a problem in our economy. We also sometimes subsidize goods in order to encourage spending in other areas. So America subsidizes a little bit on every single gallon of gas that's brought over here. We subsidize gas prices in order to encourage tourism. People are able to take more road trips if gas prices are low. Shipping costs are lower. All of those things, all of those spending increases when gas prices are low. So that's kind of what subsidies are. So knowing that, do subsidies make production costs more or less to the producers? Less, because they're being given a little bit of money for every unit they produce, so their overall costs are lower. If a business received a subsidy, what would that do to supply? Do you think you'd want to supply more of something if you're being given money from the government for supplying it? Absolutely. So anything that we decide to subsidize, the supply of those goods increases, it shifts to the right. Subsidies and taxes are both controlled by the government. But subsidies are when the government gives money, they want to encourage this business. Taxes are when the government takes money. They require businesses to pay taxes on a certain industry. So if businesses have to pay more in business taxes to produce a certain good, what do you think would happen to the overall supply? That would decrease supply. So if there's a certain type of product that the government is trying to discourage production of, they could raise business taxes on that good, and that will cut supply. So subsidies, an increase in subsidies increases supply because they're getting paid to produce each one, whereas an increase in taxes decreases supply because the business has to pay money to produce it. It hurts their profits. The T in RISIS stands for technology. When there is more technology, producers are able to produce more, usually more efficiently and at lower costs. If the cost of production is lowered, how will that affect overall supply? It will increase it because they only care about profit. If costs of production are down, that means profit is up. So producers will make more at any price point with better technology because it's helping their profit no matter what. The example here, a new computer makes producing paper clips cheaper for producers. Describe the shift the supply curve for paper clips. The supply for paper clips will increase. It will shift to the right. So that's all for the supply shifters. In the next module, we're going to put supply and demand together. So make sure that you've looked over your demand shifters and your supply shifter, because soon you'll have to know which is which to know which line will be affected.